unveils his latest round of global tariffs. I'm Christina McFarlane in for Max Foster. This is what we know. Markets around the world are facing steep losses in the wake of a new round of sweeping tariffs from President Donald Trump. Higher tariffs against more than 60 US trade partners are now scheduled to go into effect next Thursday as the president ramps up his trade war. A 10% tariff increase will apply to countries the US has a trade surplus with. Nations that have a trade deficit with the United States are facing a minimum 15% tariff rate. Well, neighbouring Canada is being hit with a 35% tariff rate, while President Trump agreed to a 90-day pause on new tariffs for Mexico. China, meanwhile, is looking at a whopping 64% tariff rate if it fails to make a deal with the US by that August 12th deadline. And a quick check of the US stocks less than an hour before the closing bell. The Dow there, as you can see, down by 1.3, and it has been in the red all day. Arrows across the board in the wake of the trade tariff announcements. Now let's go straight out to CNN's Kevin Liptak, who's joining us from the White House. And Kevin, we really are now in an entirely new era, it seems. President Trump shaping global trade as he pledged to do, the highest tariff hikes in more than a century. But I think what we weren't expecting is that these wouldn't go into effect for another week, which I guess allows for a bit more wiggle room and a bit more time for negotiation.
Yeah, it both allows the customs inspectors in the United States to get used to some of these new tariffs and prepare to apply them to imports into the U.S., but it also gives these countries time to try and wrangle to get their rate lowered. And in fact, we did hear from President Trump just yesterday afternoon that the delegations were still coming to try and negotiate these new trade deals. This week-long grace period does allow them some more time to do that. The other sort of aspect of the timing that is interesting is that the goods that are on ships loaded up by the August 7th deadline, by next Thursday, that don't arrive in the U.S. until October 5th will also not be subject to the new tariffs. And so that could potentially put off the risk of higher prices for consumers that economists have been warning about, potentially, maybe to the end of the year, the start of next year. And so you do see how the timing of all of this will have a major impact on how consumers are affected and how these countries will try and navigate their own new trade deals. But you're right, we are now in an entirely new trade era, really reimagined by President Trump to his liking. He promised as a candidate to try and rebalance global trade to center U.S. manufacturers and U.S. workers in a way that he had been said had been devalued over the last several decades. Now we are doing just that. And I think the real question is kind of how fixed all of this is. If history is any example, the president isn't necessarily all that, adhered to some of these rates. He's shown a degree of flexibility previously. If countries come to him with some sort of offer, he seems willing to accept that. And in fact, we saw that yesterday when he announced this new 90-day reprieve for Mexico that would put off some of the heaviest tariffs on that country as he and the president, Claudia Sheinbaum, try and work out a trade deal. So the president, now near a new era, clearly feeling very vindicated in this policy that had seen so many fits and starts and extensions and delays since he kind of first announced it back in April. Now the president seems very intent on allowing this new tariff regime to take effect.
All right, Kevin Liptak, thank you.